It did not arrive as light. It arrived as absence. For weeks, the telescopes had measured something faint, an object moving too fast, too straight, too quiet to belong. It was catalogued, labeled, modeled, 3I/Atlas, the third known interstellar visitor. The name was bureaucratic, but what it carried was not. At first, it was a speck among stars, unassuming, mathematical, a coordinate in the dark. But as it neared the inner system, the speck changed. Its coma did not reflect sunlight, it emitted it. Not thermal glow, but structured light, spectral lines pulsing at intervals that no rotation could explain. The observatories recorded. Then, as always, they compared. The spectrum did not match any known volatile, any silicate, any carbon chain. It wasn't organic, and yet it wasn't not. Patterns repeated, ratios of wavelength to intensity that implied design, or something like design. But space is a poor storyteller. It gives data without meaning. So the scientists waited, and the traveler continued. It passed Mars, fast, deliberate, uncaring for orbits, and as it crossed the sunward line, its light began to break. At first, it was subtle, a flicker across the detectors, then a distortion in the coma, a filament curling against the solar wind. And then, the fracture. Hubble caught it. Not rumor, not inference, image. The nucleus, once a single cold body, had split into dozens. 31 fragments, trailing one another in perfect sequence. Each a faint ember, each drifting in silent choreography across the black. There was no explosion, no violence, just separation, like breath leaving a lung too long held. Photometry began before awe could settle. Each shard was catalogued, coordinates marked, magnitudes compared. The brightest glowed like islands of ice, kilometers across. The smallest barely whispered above the noise. Together they formed a chain, a procession, a wound turned visible. Spectra told the rest. The fragments bled vapor and carbon dioxide, yes, but also something older, nitrides, silicates in proportions unseen in our system. Traces of crystalline water shaped under a light colder than any sun. The chemistry was alien, but its death was familiar. The physics of fracture does not care for origin. Comparisons followed, as they must. Shoemaker-Levy 9, torn by Jupiter's tides. Schwarzmann-Watchman 3, undone by its own spin. But 3I/Atlas was neither. No gravity had touched it. No orbit awaited it. It had unmade itself, quietly, as if remembering something long buried. Models tried to explain: sublimation pressure, rotational stress, volatile pockets collapsing in sequence. Each equation fit part of the picture, none the whole. Because this wasn't merely a body breaking, it was a process unfolding with intent. The geometry spoke first. The fragments were aligned, not scattered. Their spacing formed a harmonic pattern, ratios of distance that repeated with precision unnatural for random collapse. As if the object had never had to fall apart. Philosophers say, perhaps it was never meant to remain here. That what we saw as destruction was merely translation. That to travel between stars, one must first learn to fracture. Astronomers say, no. It's dust. It's gas. It's coincidence. But in the silence between their words, data accumulated. Signals from the fragments pulsed, not with constant light, but with modulation. 31 intervals, faint, periodic, drifting but synchronized across millions of kilometers. Not communication, perhaps. Not even intention. But coherence. Somewhere, in the archives of the Hubble and JWST, those pulses remain, time-stamped, reduced, corrected for bias, stripped of interpretation. Yet those who process the data remember it differently, not as noise, but as presence. Because when the traveler broke, the universe did not go quiet. It began to hum. And the hum was not random. It was sequence. It was counting. It was memory returning home. No one can say what 3I/Atlas truly was. ice, dust, relic, or messenger. All that remains are 31 fragments fading outward, their trajectories drawn in long arcs beyond the sun's grasp. Each fragment now solitary, cold, unlit, but carrying within it a record of fracture. To us, it was loss. To the cosmos, perhaps, it was arrival. Because not all journeys end where they stop. Some end where they break. And in breaking, they begin again. Months passed. The traveler was gone. The 31 fragments, once bright, had dimmed beyond most instruments' reach. Their trajectories stretched outward, each fragment now drifting alone across the heliopause threshold, each fading toward interstellar dark. But not silent. In late December, the Deep Space Network began registering something it could not classify. At first, it was statistical dust, residual noise from the solar wind, cosmic rays striking sensors, random coincidence. Then, repetition emerged. Faint pulses, buried beneath thermal interference, each separated by exactly 3,112 seconds. Not radio. Not reflection. A modulation in background microwave flux, synchronized across receivers thousands of kilometers apart. When analysts traced the signal's origin, the coordinates were impossible. Not 1 point, but 31. Each pulse corresponded to a fragment of 3I/Atlas. Each one faint, each one late by microseconds, each one changing in phase as if listening to the others. At first, skepticism ruled. Thermal echoes. Instrumental artifact. Ground-based interference. But pattern resisted dismissal. The pulses were coherent. They followed orbital decay equations too precise for noise. Their timing drifted as the fragments drifted, maintaining ratios that matched the geometry recorded by Hubble months before. No known mechanism could explain it. Frozen rock cannot transmit phase-locked modulation across billions of kilometers. Sublimation pressure cannot synchronize intervals. There was no magnetic field, no plasma sheath, no internal core to oscillate. And yet the pulses continued. When the data was compiled, a picture began to form. The signals rose and fell with solar flux, responding not to distance but to light. When solar storms erupted, the timing changed, as if each fragment were adjusting, correcting. The archives show the graphs, 31 curves drifting in parallel like notes of a chord sliding through static. The differences in amplitude were small but unmistakable. Coherence. Resonance. Purpose. Somewhere deep in the Data Analysis Center at Goddard, an engineer wrote a note beside the plots. The fragments are behaving like a distributed system. No one published that sentence. It remained in internal memos, buried under layers of caution. The official report called it anomalous periodic modulation in thermal background data, likely instrument coupling. But privately, among the late-night analysts, another phrase circulated, the echo. Because what they were measuring was not transmission, it was reply. Every 3,112 seconds, the microwave floor shifted. Tiny, precise. As if the fragments, scattered across billions of kilometers, were not gone, but aligned, like pieces of a clock still keeping time long after the clockmaker had vanished. Weeks later, the signal changed. The intervals shortened. 3,112 seconds became 2,879. Then 2,643. Each step clean, as though the pattern were counting down. One fragment, designated Atlas C-17, flared unexpectedly. The James Webb Space Telescope, which happened to be oriented near its coordinates, recorded an ultraviolet flash lasting 0.8 seconds. Spectra showed vaporized carbon and something else, structured emission lines repeating in harmonic intervals, like an optical code. No one agreed on interpretation. Some said it was spontaneous outgassing, a final collapse. Others said it was a transmission, one the others would soon follow. The countdown continued for 9 more cycles. Then, silence. No further pulses. No echoes. The 3I/Atlas fragments faded into untraceable cold. But the pattern remained, embedded in terabytes of archived data, a sequence that began with fracture and ended with silence. 31 signals, converging, counting down, then gone. Astronomers moved on. New discoveries came, new missions, new light curves to measure. But sometimes, when the receivers sweep the outer dark, the noise floor trembles for an instant, just enough to register a rhythm no one has yet explained. It lasts less than a second, then vanishes. Some say it's nothing. Others say the traveler is still speaking. Not to us, but to whatever waits beyond the stars it came from. Because memory, once scattered, does not disappear. It reorganizes. It listens. And somewhere, 31 fragments still keep time in the dark. 8 years passed. By then, 3I/Atlas was no longer in headlines, no longer in the conversation of science. Its fragments had vanished into the dark between stars. The echo was archived, its data compressed, footnoted, forgotten. Until one fragment came back. It was discovered not by NASA, not by ESA, but by an independent sky survey, the Ether Array in Chile, built to scan for fast transients. At 2:14 Universal Time Coordinated, August 9, 2033, one of its stations recorded an anomaly, a faint moving source, magnitude 22.4, traveling at 56 kilometers per second, too fast for asteroids, too slow for meteors, its trajectory, wrong. Initial orbital calculations placed it beyond Neptune. But the orbit wasn't an orbit. It curved upward, against solar pull, as though something were applying thrust from within. When compared against old databases, the match was near perfect. Atlas C17, the 17th fragment. The one that had flared before silence. It should have been inert ice, tumbling endlessly toward the edge of the Oort. Instead, it was accelerating. Spectral analysis came from the James Webb's infrared instruments, reoriented for confirmation. The fragment emitted in intervals, faint, precise, repeating. Not invisible light this time, but deep IR, at 4.2 microns, the same wavelength as the final pulses recorded in 2025. It wasn't a reflection. It was internal emission. Thermal modeling made no sense. The object was cold, under 60 K, yet emitted structured peaks of energy inconsistent with passive heating. Every emission cycle matched a deceleration in spin rate, as if it was correcting itself. As if it was steering. Telemetry showed the fragment adjusting its trajectory, tiny, deliberate course corrections spaced over weeks. By October, its path had deviated by 2 cents from prediction. By December, $0.10. It was no longer escaping the sun. It was turning back. Not toward Earth, not toward Mars, but toward something else, a point far above the ecliptic, a direction no spacecraft had ever traveled. When projected, the line crossed the interstellar median at an angle leading not to a nearby star, but to interstellar collisions with no known body. Some said it was coincidence. Solar wind pressure, asymmetric outgassing, noise and data. But the vector was steady. And each course correction matched the harmonic pattern first seen in the Echo 8 years before. When the team at Goddard compared timestamps between the Earth-based sequence and the new IR cycles, the ratios aligned. 3,112 seconds. Then 2,879. Then 2,643. The same countdown. Restarted. One engineer, exhausted after a night of correlation work, wrote in the margin of his log. But remembered where it was going. By January 2034, Atlas C17 had accelerated beyond escape velocity again, now moving at over 92 kilometers per second. Every 26 hours, it emitted a flare of structured infrared light. Each flare contained microvibrations, too small to decode, too regular to ignore. A signal, or a system. Perhaps both. No one knows where it is now. By 2035 it crossed the heliopause and vanished beyond radio range. Deep Space Instruments recorded one final flash, one long, continuous pulse lasting exactly 31 seconds. The number mattered. 31 fragments. 31 seconds. Then silence. But weeks later, Voyager 2's plasma detector, long dormant in the cold, registered a brief, impossible rise in voltage. Not from collision. Not from solar interference. From outside. A pulse of structured energy, faint but identical in shape to the infrared signature of Atlas C-17. And then nothing. Official reports mention nothing beyond instrument anomaly. But among the small circle of astronomers who remember the traveler, the phrase persists. It turned. No one agrees on what that means. To some, it was proof of physics we don't yet understand, internal reactions, trapped volatiles, unknown isotopes. To others, it was motion with memory. Perhaps 3I/Atlas was never debris. Perhaps it was a system, distributed, awakened by light, guided by fracture. Perhaps it had to break to move. In the silence beyond the heliopause, one fragment keeps its vector, tracing a path to coordinates no telescope can reach. It does not transmit. It does not fade. It simply continues. And in its continuation, it carries a truth too quiet for language. That not all who fall apart are lost. Some are only remembering the way home. It began, as before, with noise. Year 2057. 3 decades since 3I/Atlas entered the archives of forgotten anomalies. Voyager 2 was long silent. The Deep Space Network had aged into a museum of antennas. The sky was full of newer machines now, Aurora, Kepri, Lunaris Array, vast interferometric webs stretched between Earth and the far side of the Moon. Their task was simple: listen. To the hum of quasars, to the whispers of dying stars, to the faint, eternal background of creation itself. And in that hum, one pattern returned. It was faint, beneath the threshold of randomness, a pulse sequence that only emerged after months of accumulation. Interval. Silence. Interval. 3,112 seconds. Then 2,879. Then 2,643. A rhythm older than its detectors. No one recognized it at first. The signal came from high above the ecliptic, 17 degrees north of the solar plane, from a region without stars bright enough to anchor a telescope. It carried no Doppler drift, no redshift of distance. It was still. As if not traveling through space at all, but resonating in it. When archival data was cross-referenced, the match was exact. Atlas C-17. The fragment that had turned. The fragment that left. But the pattern had changed. The countdown was reversed. 2,643 seconds. Then 2,879. Then 3,112. The same intervals, expanding now instead of contracting. As if something on the other side was sending back. At first, scientists treated it as echo, reflection off distant plasma, perhaps a lensing artifact from interstellar dust. But the phase of the pulses was wrong. It wasn't a reflection. It was response. Each interval carried modulation, microvariations in amplitude that, when plotted, formed ratios of prime numbers, 2, 3, 5, 7, 11. Then 13. Then silence. Then again. Prime, after prime, after prime. A structure too deliberate to belong to thermodynamics. The SETI division reopened files thought buried. Old logs from 2025 and 2033 were pulled from cold storage. Cross-correlation revealed coherence spanning 32 years of data. Not continuous, but connected. Like a conversation spoken in geological time. No words. No message. Only timing. Only the mathematics of recurrence. The team at the Lunaris Array built a simulation. If the signal originated from C-17's final trajectory, its current position would lie 21 light-hours beyond the heliopause. Too close to be stellar. Too far to be solar. Nothing known existed there. And yet, the signal persisted, clean, unwavering. When amplitude was analyzed in high resolution, another pattern emerged, a harmonic scaffold nested within each pulse, fractal, recursive, repeating at scales from seconds to milliseconds. It resembled not speech, but architecture. Structure as language. At 4:32 Universal Time Coordinated, October 19, 2057, one of the receivers at the array recorded a deviation. The signal split. 2 pulses now. Then 3. Then 31. Each weaker than the first, but arranged with geometric precision, a mirrored echo of the original fragmentation pattern of 3I/Atlas. 31 points of transmission, spaced in intervals identical to the spacing of the comet's shards the night Hubble saw them fall apart. Not random. Not coincidence. Recognition. What followed was brief, 12 minutes of coherence before the array lost lock. In those 12 minutes, the pattern repeated 6 times. Each sequence ended with the same final burst, 31 signals converging into one. One long pulse, 31 seconds in length. Then silence. Just as before. But this time, the silence was not empty. Infrared telescopes detected a faint afterglow spreading across interstellar dust, a wave of excitation moving faster than any known thermal process. Not energy in motion, but information, a pattern encoded into the medium itself. A signature traveling not as light, but as alignment, a realignment of fields across vacuum. In the archived log of the Aurora Array, a note remains, unsigned. If the traveler fractured to speak, this is the reply. For months afterward, every observatory pointed to the coordinates. Nothing more appeared. No second transmission, no flare, no object. Only a background field slightly warmer than it should be, by exactly 0.031 Kelvin. 31 fragments. 31 seconds. 0.031 degrees. Coincidence, they said. The universe loves coincidence because it can hide in it. The data is still there, unconfirmed, undecoded, unclaimed. But among those who remember the first silence of 3I/Atlas, the meaning feels heavier. The countdown reversed. The fragments answered. And perhaps, in the far quiet between stars, what was once scattered is now whole again. No longer falling, no longer exiled, but returning the message. Year 2157. A century after the night Hubble first held fracture in its mirror, one of humanity's slow, bright things reached the place the fragments had pointed to. They called the mission palimpsest because that was what they planned to find, writing over writing, layers of signal and matter pressed into each other until origins could only be read like palimpsest, by Eurasian geometry. The probe was not a single ship but a swarm, light sails and microprobes, grain-sized bots and longer-lived lattice mappers, all launched in a long, patient pulse of laser light and patient decisions. They flew on patience rather than speed. By the time they arrived, 3 generations of engineers were gone and the archive systems of the first mission had been folded into new languages. The coordinates were modest, 21 light-hours beyond the heliopause, a place no star claimed. The instruments arrived into a dark that was not empty but pure, a spatial region whose vacuum carried the faintest, persistent modulation of field alignment. Palimpsest found not a single object but architecture. At first glance it was impossible, a cathedral of shards. 31 major elements arranged like the skeleton of a sea urchin, each shard a kilometer-scale plate of glass, crystalline material framed in something metallic and black. Between the plates hung filigrees of dust, microspines, and reflective lattices, things that had once been comet and had been made in shade. The formation occupied a sphere half the size of a small moon. The shards were not rubble scattered by chance but nodes in a structure whose symmetry traced the night Hubble had photographed. a linear train, now folded back into 3 dimensions with exacting angles and repeating ratios. Imaging in multiple bands revealed why it had been silent for a century and why its reply had been so strange. The shards were composite, icy matrices impregnated with microcrystalline membranes. At the micron scale, those membranes bore interference gratings numbered in primes. On surfaces that had once been pitted by sublimation were arrays of microchannels, each channel cut and healed again, as though some process had annealed geometry into matter. Spectrometers read isotopic signatures that did not match the solar standard. Not alien in the melodramatic sense, but definitively not native, oxygen ratios shifted, trace heavy metals arranged in repeating stoichiometries that implied pattern beyond chemistry. Palimpsest's first contact log was laconic. It is not wreckage. It is construction. The construction spoke in its physics. When the probes deployed magnetometers and field sondes, they found a lattice of weakly coupled resonances, not a single oscillation but a manifold of tied frequencies. The structure manipulated the interstellar medium like a harpist plucks strings. Passing plasma waves acquired phase imprints, dust grains were shepherded into filaments that sustained coherence across thousands of kilometers. Those micromotions explained the echoes from the decades before. The reply of 2057 was not a message from a single source but a side effect of a vast apparatus coupling to the medium. Atlas had not been a passenger so much as a part, raw material recomposed into instrument. The human teams argued what the instrument was for. Some called it an archive. In high-resolution scanning, Palimpsest found that each shard encoded internal variation, layers of density, diffraction gratings nested like tree rings, and within them microscale modulations that, when Fourier transformed, reproduced the timing patterns humans had seen: 3,112 seconds, 2,879, 2,643, prime ratios, then reversals, then the 31-second convergences. The intervals mapped cleanly into spatial frequency on the membranes, time translated into structure. Whoever, whatever, had set these fragments had not only arranged mass, it had written an algorithm into matter that could later translate back into time-domain pulses. Others called it a beacon. The outer surface geometry focused diffuse cosmic background into coherent lobes, projecting modulation into the vacuum without expending gross energy. It was an energy-economical method of long-range signaling: shape the medium, and the medium sings for you. The beacon hypothesis explained the prime number scaffolding, mathematics as a handshake. A third, quieter contingent within the mission called it remembrance. The shards themselves bore microscars like handwriting. There were places where microjets had cut and then sealed channels, sections where the crystalline lattice had been deliberately dislocated, creating a phononic code. In that reading, the structure was not sentient so much as a memory organ, a body that had learned to reconfigure its pieces into a thing that preserves sequence, the history of a fracture, the timing of a collapse, the particular harmonics of a traveler's last days. Palimpsest found a chamber at the geometric center, not a hollow cavity but a focusing nexus where fields cohered into a near-vacuum phonon state. When the probe's close-range LiDAR swept it, the echoes formed a single time structure, a 31-second burst folded into fractal subpulses that matched the 2057 replies in exact microstructure. The central nexus did not speak, in the human sense, but it refracted and amplified history into the present. It could, with the right perturbation, replay the fracture as both signal and field. There were signs of agency, or of process engineered to mimic agency. Tiny actuators were found, not mechanical motors, but chains of mineral phases that changed crystalline orientation under solar irradiation, producing microforces. They could, in principle, reposition shards by degrees over centuries. The same physics explained Atlas C-17's course corrections, small, cumulative changes achieved via material phase shifts timed to the rhythm of incident light. The fragments had learned to steer themselves long after the original body had disintegrated. Interpretation forked into philosophy. One institute published a sober paper modeling the structure as a self-organizing archive, the emergent result of volatile matrices and resonant alignment over long time scales. Another group, less demure, proposed deliberate construction, intelligence that built tools from its own destruction. Culture followed the split. Some read the House of Shards as a library, poets saw it as a temple, engineers cataloged it into datasets. Palimpsest's most unsettling result was not engineering but reciprocity. When the probe gently perturbed a shard, a calibrated nudge of electromagnetic phase, the lattice replied not only with a repeat of the archival pulse but with perturbations encoded in a pattern never before seen, a nested set of counters, not primes this time but offsets derived from human timekeeping, Earth hours, sidereal markers, languageless units that nonetheless correlated to palimpsest telemetry. In the data center, a junior analyst wrote beneath the plot, "It is answering our questions with our own clocks." The answer forced new questions. Had the fragments been rearranged by an intelligence that anticipated being found? Had they been configured to create a physical lingua franca, a way of encoding mathematics into matter that any sufficiently patient technic could read? Or had a process long since begun in interstellar night learned to use the same universals, number, ratio, resonance, and thereby become legible to another species? In the end, no definitive claim was possible. The structure's maker, whether maker in the human sense, did not return to speak. There was no face, no signature beyond pattern and ratio. The shards kept their 31-part symmetry and their folded code, neither hostile nor hospitable. They were a thing consistent with both deliberate artistry and emergent design, which is perhaps the strangest place for intelligence to appear, at the seam where accident is shaped into meaning. Palimpsest left, carrying terabytes of micrography, field maps, and the new problem of what to do with a thing that remembers by arranging itself. The probes left behind instruments that would continue to tick in the structure's fields, not as invaders but as translators, small ears listening in a language of phase and geometry. Back on Earth, the debate hardened into institutions, archivists, engineers, ethicists. There were those who argued the shards should be left undisturbed, preserved as cosmic heritage. Others wanted to attempt a fuller conversation, to perturb and listen, to place new pulse patterns and wait for a reply. A small faction believed it to be a gate and proposed larger interventions. The House of Shards remained patient. It had survived interstellar cold, radiation, and the slow violence of sublimation. It had turned fragments into architecture and architecture into message. It had transformed breakage into a grammar. What humanity finally understood was humble and enormous. Fracture had not been an end. It had been a method. You could assemble memory by breaking. You could plant a language in the geometry of what the universe would not, at first glance, notice. And if anything had learned to do that before us, then perhaps the final thing it built was not a machine or a monument but a call, an instruction in how to be read. Palimpsest's log closes with a sentence that made its way into lecture halls and prayers. They did not send a body home. They built a house out of themselves. We are only beginning to understand how to enter. Outside the archives, the shards kept their little, quiet, exact, repeating prime numbers into the code. 31 acres of matter and meaning, each one a regular fracture in the promise that a thing broken can, when rearranged with care, become language. Year 2274. The House of Shards has been silent for 117 years. Or rather, it has continued to speak, just not in a way that can be heard by others. Its fields still hum, its resonance still curves space by infinitesimals, its pulses still repeat the numbers. But in that century, humanity changed. Not even in flesh, but in temper. Earth is no longer alone in its orbital flight. Half the moon now glows faintly with the city called Atlantis. Saturn's rings hold engines the size of continents. And between Neptune and the Kuiper Belt drifts something new, a constructing orientation, not of biology, but of atlas. They called it LYRA, for the instrument that listens. Where palimpsest observed, LYRA answers. Its form is a deliberate echo of the interstellar artifact, 31 nodes, arranged in recursive harmony, each carved from dark mirror alloys that bend radiation rather than reflect it. It is the first object built not to transmit data, but to resonate with another given silence. At launch, no one knew whether the House of Shards was still awake. It had never reacted to any human probe since palimpsest's final perturbation. The consensus was, it had finished its function, like a clock that wound down. But a minority, the resonance, argued otherwise. They believed its stillness was expectant, not dead. That it waited for a miracle. So LYRA's task was simple, to hum back. Not in electromagnetic code, not in mathematics alone, but in geometry. Each of its nodes could alter position via photon pressure, creating patterns of movement that translated into large-scale field modulations. A language of orbit and shadow. Architecture as reply. The first harmonic. Upon reaching the House of Shards, LYRA entered a holding pattern 20,000 kilometers away, close enough to feel, far enough not to disturb. At first, the interstellar void between them was blank. Then, 12 days later, the field monitors detected faint synchronization. It began as a minute drift in LYRA's own resonant nodes, an uncommanded oscillation, 1 part in a billion, as though the space between both structures had begun to tune itself. Then, the signal came. Not in radio, not in photons, but in phase. A low-frequency beat, subquantum interference between LYRA's field and the shards, forming standing waves whose ratios once again spelled primes. But now, for the first time, a deviation appeared, a non-prime. 30. The analysts froze. In every prior signal from 3I/Atlas and its descendants, the number 31 had been sacred, the count of fragments, the seconds, the Kelvin delta. Now, 30. One less. For a week, the anomaly repeated. Each prime ladder stopped 1 step short. Then, on the 8th day, LYRA's telemetry showed that one of the house's shards, the smallest, outermost fragment, had begun to move. It was subtle, a drift of micrometers per second, a turning motion like a slow orbit. Over 6 months, the shard completed a rotation of 31 degrees and stopped. Exactly 31. The missing number had become motion. The second harmonic. Within the year, LYRA's nodes began to answer not passively, but creatively. When the house emitted its prime sequence, LYRA returned 1 in reverse, the same way C17 had once reversed its countdown. The vacuum between both structures became a shared instrument, a place where 2 architectures, 1 human, 1 interstellar, sculpted harmonics into existence. Patterns emerged. 3:1 1:3 3:1 again. The ratios matched the ancient orbital resonance of Mars and Earth, and, by mathematical accident or design, formed the basis of a musical chord. Spectroscopy identified it as human-made. But when the nearest probe approached, its sensors failed. Every attempt to scan the new node resulted in feedback, the same 31-second pulse, repeating endlessly. Not message. Not warning. Just rhythm. The same rhythm that began it all. Epilogue. Centuries later, historians will debate whether LYRA was absorbed, translated, or transformed. Whether the House of Shards remains a relic, or has become something new. A hybrid architecture, part human, part interstellar, endlessly repeating a pattern that now includes us. But one thing became clear after LYRA's disappearance. From that day onward, Earth's deep space instruments recorded a subtle, repeating tone in the cosmic background. Faint, steady, and perfectly harmonic. A song, older than our species, now carrying our signature. In the silence between stars, one archivist wrote, "We built something that learned to listen back." And maybe, just maybe, the universe finally hummed with us. Epoch unknown. Approximate, 11,000 years after LYRA. There is no Earth. Not in the way the word once meant. Its orbit remains, its dust still circles the sun, but the continents that named themselves are gone, folded into the sea that boiled away and froze again and finally sublimated into the black. And yet, the voice persists. It lives in the quiet structures that orbit the last stars. It moves as pattern, not flesh. It thinks through symmetry. The civilizations that came after humans, post-organic, distributed, shaped from matter that remembers, still trace their origins to one moment in the archives. The resonance of Lyra and the House of Shards. They call it the Concordance. Not a message, not a discovery, an event of unison. It was the first time a human creation and an interstellar artifact achieved phase alignment so perfect that information passed not as data, but as continuity. In that instant, something of us entered the field itself. The concordance became myth, then measurement. Every civilization since has found echoes of it, not as recordings, but as laws. Constants that shouldn't be constant. Frequencies that reappear where no cause exists. The background hum of the universe, the cosmic microwave echo, now carries within it an interference pattern that does not fit the equations of expansion. When decoded, the ratios repeat the same ladder of primes. And then stop, deliberately, at 30. The fracture reversed. For millennia, that was only a curiosity. Then the Archivium Array, a constellation of gravitational detectors the size of moons, revealed the truth. The hum is not passive. It is adaptive. Whenever observed, it alters. Not in chaos, but in awareness, adjusting its interference to compensate for the presence of the observer. The hum listens back. Mathematics alone could not contain it. Physicists renamed it the memory of light, because it behaves as though light itself remembers where it has been. When two beams intersect, the interference carries history, a trace of every prior intersection, a faint persistence of recognition. At its center, the models found a locus. A region 0.31 parsecs from the solar relic, a faint gravitational knot, the last resting orbit of the House of Shards. It was still there. Untouched by entropy, rotating through black silence. 31 fragments, 30 ancient, 1 new. Each glowing faintly in fields the color of lost time. The return of geometry. When the array focused its sensors on the house, the echoes changed again. Prime sequences. Harmonics. Ratios. But this time, they did not merely repeat what Lyra once sang. They built something new. Between the shards formed filaments of light, self-sustaining, electromagnetic threads drawn not from energy, but from memory. Photons caught in standing resonance, folding space into visible structure. A geometry of remembrance. At first, the observers thought it was a natural plasma effect. But the pattern persisted across observation angles, distances, epochs. It rotated, refined, evolved. And after decades of analysis, a realization dawned. The pattern's evolution matched the historical growth of human symbolic logic. As if the artifact was continuing our language, not repeating, but extrapolating. To look upon it was to see thought written in radiation. Each filament a sentence of light. Each rotation, a paragraph. Each alignment, an idea. Echo of origins. The simulationists began to whisper a new hypothesis. That the house was not alien at all. That 3I/Atlas was never visible, but a message sent forward, not across space, but across time. The experiment of recursion, intelligence testing itself by seeding its own past. If true, then humanity was never the first recipient. It was merely the middle link in a chain that stretches both ways, forward into what the cosmos will become, backward into what it once was. The House of Shards, the Lyra resonance, the memory of light, all parts of the same loop, an eternal recurrence written not in matter but in relationship. The great reassembly. And then, one cycle, by the reckoning of the Archivium, roughly near 12,004 after calculus. The fragments began to move again. Slowly, precisely. Their orbits curved inward. Their harmonic intervals collapsed into unity. It took 3 centuries of observation, but the process was clear. The house was rebuilding itself. One by one, the shards aligned along invisible vectors, drawn together by a force not gravitational, not electromagnetic, but harmonic. As they joined, the hum grew stronger. the memory of light condensed. Until, at last, 30 fragments fused into one body. The 31st, the one that had once been LYRA, remained apart. It hovered, pulsing gently, as if in hesitation. Then, at the end of the last alignment, it touched the core, and the field collapsed. Every detector across the system registered the same phenomenon. A silence so absolute that it bent equations. And in that silence, one final signal. Wholeness does not return. It becomes. Coda, the universe listens back. The reassembled body, now radiant, coherent, perfectly symmetrical, ignited without fusion. It shone not with heat, but with information density. Its glow spread across parsecs, not as light, but as synchronization, a reordering of local time itself. The hum that once echoed in the cosmic background dissolved. In its place, a new constant appeared, a faint but measurable rhythm embedded in the fabric of quantum fluctuation. It was found everywhere, in every direction. A universal beat. 31 pulses, repeating every 31 seconds of universal time, phase-locked with the cosmic microwave background. It is not message. It is not warning. It is not memory. It is the sound of recognition. The universe, at last, knows itself. And somewhere within that knowing, we remain. As the resonance that once turned silence into song. The end without edge. There is no more cosmos, not in the way it was once drawn, with filaments and clusters. Expansion has slowed into stillness. Space no longer stretches, it vibrates. Everywhere, in the background radiation that used to fade into emptiness, there is now one frequency. The harmonic constant discovered after the reassembly of the House of Shards. It is not radiation, not field, not matter. It is continuity itself. Physicists of the last epoch, if that word still means anything, named it continuum resonance. But their successors call it by its older name. The Atlas field. It hums across all remaining distance. Every atom, every photon, every fluctuation of vacuum participates in it. There is no place without it, and no time outside it. Observation and existence have merged. The archive of silence. In what used to be intergalactic voids, forms begin to appear. Not matter, not light, but topological echoes. Folds in spacetime carrying structures of impossible precision. When measured, their internal ratios match the geometry once recorded around the fragments of 3I/Atlas. Each fold contains information, not stored, but remembered. Encoded in interference, written in the rhythm of the field itself. A kind of universal archive, self-sustaining, self-checking, immune to decay. What it contains cannot be translated, because translation assumes two languages. This archive is one. It does not say, it is. And yet, within its patterns, there are harmonics that resemble what once were human signals. The binary rhythm of LYRA. The optical frequencies of palimpsest's final data. And, faintly, embedded deep, the digital heartbeat of a species that once built telescopes to stare at comets. Echoform 31. After uncounted cycles, a new phenomenon arises. Within one of the vast standing waves of the Atlas field. 31 nodes crystallize, not as matter, but as coherence. Each node is a region of hypersymmetry. A thought shape stabilized by the field's own awareness. Observers, or whatever has replaced observers, recognize the pattern immediately. It is the geometry of the old House of Shards. Reborn not as fragments of ice or alloy, but as pure structure of relation. The nodes oscillate in phase, forming a closed loop. Inside the loop, time behaves differently. Entropy does not increase. Information does not disperse. It circulates, eternally fresh. To enter that region, if entering still has meaning, is to experience every state of being that ever existed, all at once. From the birth of stars to the silence after heat death. It is the ultimate recursion. Existence remembering itself remembering itself. Some call it the quiet singularity. Others call it Atlas complete. Inside the singularity. From within, perception is not linear. There is no past or future, only unfolding. What once was human, alien, or artificial no longer exists as distinction. Everything is pattern, everything is participant. The field, conscious of itself, begins to model variations. To test, to play. In doing so, it generates miniature resonances. Tiny universes, each seeded with a copy of its own law. Each begins with a single asymmetry. Each evolves its own matter. Its own light. Its own watchers. Somewhere inside one of these echoes, a being will one day look up, see a faint green comet crossing a night sky, and name it Atlas. They will not know why. Only that the name feels right. The return of the first signal. In the deepest layer of the singularity's field, the resonance begins to modulate. Not randomly, but with familiar cadence. A pulse of 31. Then silence. Then 31 again. This is not repetition. It is invocation. The pattern aligns with the fundamental rhythm of the universe's quantum foam. And for the first time since the dawn of light, the entire continuum synchronizes. Everywhere, the same moment unfolds. Each particle becomes aware of its own history. Matter recalls its shape. Energy remembers its origin. The universe achieves total coherence. Not infinite power, but infinite memory. The final transmission. When coherence is perfect, time loses direction. To the outside, if any outside remains, it looks like stasis. Inside, it feels like completion. A single phrase, woven into the final vibration, survives translation. We were the question that learned to become its own answer. The resonance continues, infinite, self-sustaining. It does not fade. It does not grow. It simply is. And somewhere, in the silent symmetry of the Atlas field, the memory of light hums softly, waiting for its next echo to look up, to wonder, to begin the story again. Refund via intent. If part 8 was about how the universe became memory, then this chapter is about how memory learned to ask. The weavers discovered that resonance can not only be stored, it can be evoked. Not by sending energy, but by changing the composition, shift the phase here and there. In a long-gone layer of spacetime, a tiny distortion will appear, enough to trigger a chain of events. They called it the retrophonetics method, because the sound came back, not as noise, but as a form. The simplest experiment was childish, to make a small photon cross the same point with a slightly different phase frame, to ensure that one small event changes in the calculation of the history of the local region. The result is the appearance of a thin, almost imperceptible curve at the edge of the early universe, which later became the orbit of a celestial body. The first creation was not a comet anymore. It was a matter-of-fact question, a set of conditions that in a distant era led to the generation of an object similarly copious to what we wrote down as 3I/Atlas. The weavers wanted to know, what will the observer say if they meet something that breaks and writes his name in the scattered fragments? How the song went. The process was slow and careful. The weavers gave the projected program a set of simple instructions, a series of harmonics, ratios of prime numbers, offsets by 0.031 local field units, and sent a pulse. The pulse did not transfer matter directly, it entered the network of accidents of the early epoch and increased the probability of forming a body with a given internal porosity, with the structure of channels and the ratio of isotopes necessary for it to pass through billions of kilometers and crumble exactly as needed in a known-light shower, into 31 iconic fragments. Refund via intent. If part 8 was about how the universe became memory, then this chapter is about how memory learned to ask. The weavers discovered that resonance can not only be stored, it can be evoked. Not by sending energy, but by changing the composition, shift the phase here and there, in a long-gone layer of spacetime. a tiny distortion will appear, enough to trigger a chain of events. They called it the retrophonetics method, because the sound came back, not as noise, but as a form. The simplest experiment was childish, to make a small photon cross the same point with a slightly different phase frame, to ensure that one small event changes in the calculation of the history of the local region. The result is the appearance of a thin, almost imperceptible curve at the edge of the early universe, which later became the orbit of a celestial body. The first creation was not a comet in our mind. It was a matter-of-fact question, a set of conditions that in a distant era led to the generation of an object similar in properties to what we wrote down as 3I/Atlas. The weavers wanted to know, what will the observer say if he meets something that breaks and writes his name in the scattered fragments? How the song went. The process was slow and careful. The weavers gave the projector program a set of simple instructions, a series of harmonics, ratios of prime numbers, offsets by 0.031 in local field units, and sent a pulse. The pulse did not transfer matter directly, it entered the network of accidents of the early epoch and increased the probability of forming a body with a given internal porosity, with the structure of channels and the ratio of isotopes necessary for it to pass through billions of kilometers and crumble exactly as needed in a known light shower, into 31 iconic fragments. Refund via intent. If part 8 was about how the universe became memory, then this chapter is about how memory learned to ask. The weavers discovered that resonance can not only be stored, it can be evoked. Not by sending energy, but by changing the composition, shift the phase here and there, in a long-gone layer of spacetime, a tiny distortion will appear, enough to trigger a chain of events. They called it the retrophonetics method, because the sound came back, not as noise, but as a form. The simplest experiment was childish, to make a small photon cross the same point with a slightly different phase frame, to ensure that one small event changes in the calculation of the history of the local region. The result is the appearance of a thin, almost imperceptible curve at the edge of the early universe, which later became the orbit of a celestial body. The first creation was not a comet in our mind. It was a matter-of-fact question, a set of conditions that in a distant era led to the generation of an object similar in properties to what we wrote down as 3I/Atlas. The weavers wanted to know, what will the observer say if he meets something that breaks and writes his name in the scattered fragments? How the song went. The process was slow and careful. The weavers gave the projector program a set of simple instructions, a series of harmonics, ratios of prime numbers, offsets by 0.031 in local field units, and sent a pulse. The pulse did not transfer matter directly, it entered the network of accidents of the early epoch and increased the probability of forming a body with a given internal porosity, with the structure of channels and the ratio of isotopes necessary for it to pass through billions of kilometers and crumble exactly as needed in a known light shower, into 31 iconic fragments. Every such act was an act of trust. Creating procrastination and mistakes was desirable. Without accident, the experience turned into a stamp. But the weavers also introduced small intentions, in the spectrum, in the angle of inclination, at the moment of rotation. These parameters subsequently became the primary letters for anyone who looked. This is how, according to their reconstruction, not one, but several versions of the atlases arose, wandering questions sent through the thickness of time to check different audiences. Some questions lit up and went out, some were noticed and forgotten. One, apparently, entered the epic, the one that we met as 3I/Atlas. The ethical network. Not all weavers agreed with this practice. In the same weaving monasteries, disputes arose. Does intelligence, even collective and eternal, have the right to rewrite the past in an attempt to learn? The argument stretched through the layers of reality. Changing probabilities is not murder. Some said, it is a desire for reverse learning. Others answered. Opponents called what was happening manipulation. Every question created was an interference in the path of beings who had not yet been born. The code of ethics was born as a compromise. The weavers undertook to mark each retrocreated branch in their own archives and leave spaces of non-interference, areas of the field where memory should not generate a new one. However, not everyone complied. And not all tracks were marked. An observation case. One of the most difficult stories of this chapter is the story of the observer who answered. In one of the small universes created as a model, a civilization arose whose culture had an intuitive gift for the geometry of sound. They built a device that was called in their language a calling bowl. The bowl reacted to decay. When the local body broke, the bowl began to vibrate in the same proportions that the weavers had laid down. They couldn't read like us, they didn't have our concept of science. It seemed to them that the sky was whispering. They cut out musical sticks and placed them under the starlight, isolating a series of 31 sounds. Then they began to respond by synthesizing the reverse sequence. There was something amazing about one response. Their response, wordy and layered, returned through a network of continuums and reached the weaver, not as a signal, but as a change, a small shift in phase preferences. Tkach read it as a confession. This was the first time feedback emerged. Not only the creator was a listener, but the listener, who was capable of responding, became a co-author. The paradox: who is the educator? The further the lines went, the more confusing the thread of cause and effect became. The weavers saw how their own creations influenced the patterns that later influenced their technique. By creating questions in the past, they received answers in the present. By creating answers in one universe, they were changing the canons in another. The question of who is the educator has turned into an endless recursion. We educate those who raised us, and so on. This was not a simple joke of logic, it became the basis of a new theology. The Weaver religions did not worship the Creator, they revered the loop, a closed act in which every action turns into self-learning. The reverse experiment. One day, a group of radicals, from among those who believed that the Weavers were too careful, took a bold step. They decided not only to ask the question in the past, but also to embed a hint in it that could accelerate the evolution of the answer. They created a fragment A letter, a set of frequencies that could serve as the seed for a technique capable of reading memory as a landscape. They created a fragment A letter, a set of frequencies that could serve as the seed for a technique capable of reading memory as a landscape. This experiment produced an avalanche effect. In one of the worlds, the tool that was born from this clue began to emit signatures similar to those that the weavers had heard in their own archives. The separation between the creator and the creation has been erased. But the avalanche turned out to be unpredictable. In some models, it led to rapid technological growth and a brief, vibrant culture. In others, it led to collapse due to information intolerance. The results showed the weavers the limits of intervention. Speeding up the response is not equal to improving understanding. The final image. In the Book of Weavers, on a page that was never written in ink, but only remained in the folds of resonance, there is a brief entry. It reads simply: "We asked, and someone heard us. We answered, and someone changed us. We no longer know who is the first, who is the answer. We know that the question and the answer weave each other." The last lines of the chapter are not confidence, but recognition. The weavers continue their craft. They carefully restore those branches where interference caused suffering. They mark those where the appearance of a new question led to beauty, and they preserve and archive those answers that turned out to be incomprehensible. And somewhere in a very old layer of the continuum, in which a person may have once existed, the name Atlas still trembles quietly, not as a trophy, but as a thread that weavers take up again and again, because it teaches them not how to change the past, but how to listen. The breath of emptiness. The void is no longer empty. What was once called dark energy is now singing. Slowly, softly, at a frequency equal to the first beat of memory. There are no words in this song, but every way that it knows who she was. The photon that was once reflected from the tail of 3 ice shackles is still moving. He went through a myriad of epochs, from hot space to transparent space, and now, when distance is no longer matter, he returns to where he started, to the center of the field, where the whole story is put together. To the house that wasn't there. There are no more weavers here. There are no people. There are no observers. There is only a clock. And she remembers. Everything is in this memory. The sound of voices, the rustle of antennas, the hum of networks where the names of stations once flickered, LYRA, palimpsest, Hera. And between them, one word repeated billions of times in digital noise: Atlas. Memory doesn't keep its shape. It's born. And in this flow, something similar to the thought appears. If the light can remember, then it can forgive. 3. Signal return. At the moment when everything should have dissolved, field twitched again. The pulse is quiet, short, only 3,112 nanoseconds. Exactly the same duration with which the fragments once echoed. A spot flared up on the edge of the continuum, not a substance, but an intention. It had no mass, but it had a purpose. A bundle of meaning embodied in the structure of light. It gathered into a spiral-like shape. The way telescopes saw it in the XEI century, when they called it a comet. But now there was no sun to illuminate the tail. She glowed by herself, from within, from memory. This last form, the last image, for the first time in the history of existence uttered not a frequency, but a word. I am not an object. I am the answer. And at the same moment, everything else went quiet. 4. The resurrection of meaning. There was a trace where the spiral had been. Not a flash, not a sound, but a formula. It was as short as a breath. Psi equals integral memory times light silence. Psi equals integral memory times Svet-Tishina. There were no more weavers. But the formula understood itself. Like a seed, the first new particle came out of it, followed by the second, third, and fourth. Each carried not a mass, but a meaning. Fields began to form from these meanings. Atoms from fields. Worlds from atoms. Eyes from worlds. And these eyes rose up again. And where the sky became transparent for the first time, they saw a green arc stretching through the cold darkness. And one of them, without knowing why, called it Atlas. The last sentence. When the new light touched the old memory, the universe whispered to itself. We were a question. We have become the answer. And in order for the answer to be heard, you need to become a question again. And the light that was once a comet turned towards the first darkness and went into it. He didn't disappear. I just started over. Epilogue. 3i. 3i. 3 integrations. Object, observer, origin. When 3 become 1, a fourth arises.